So if you're anything like me, you probably don't consider yourself a front-end web developer, and you're probably not that confident when it comes to building layouts, designing web pages, and really doing anything on the front end. Now, for the longest time, I was the type of person who just said, I hate CSS, I'm never going to learn CSS, I don't want to use it, someone else can do that. But recently I've been brought into a role where I do actually need to do quite a bit of styling, and I've had to learn the basics of CSS so that I'm comfortable and competent, and I don't have to constantly be looking stuff up when I'm trying to design a page. Now, I've realized that about 90% of everything I ever need to do comes down to about 10 or 20 different CSS properties. Basic stuff that's really easy to memorize, and once you have an understanding of it, it just makes you way faster when it comes to designing some basic layouts, styling different objects, making things look half decent. So that's what I'm going to aim to teach you in this video, is kind of the absolute minimum CSS knowledge you have to be comfortable working in an HTML document and designing some relatively simple layouts, kind of aligning different items, changing the color of stuff, adding some transparency, adding rounded edges, all of that kind of stuff. That's what I'm going to aim to teach you here. And by the end of the video, you should be comfortable hopping into an HTML document, changing some styles, creating a basic layout, and no longer will you have to look up how to center a div on Stack Overflow. So if that sounds good to you, then let's go ahead and hop into the video after I share with you one very important piece of information, which is a sponsor of this video. Before we get started, I need to thank Linode for sponsoring this video. I've been using and working with Linode for nearly 3 years now, and they've consistently been my go-to choice for hosting my applications and servers. In fact, right now I'm using Linode to host the official Tech with Tim Discord bot, a website, multiple of my domains, and a Kubernetes cluster. Linode makes it super easy to spin up servers with their one-click app marketplace and have tons of written guides and YouTube videos on their channel to help you get started. Now, if you're having any issues, you can reach out to their 24/7 support team and actually talk with a real human being. Now, Linode's pricing is simple with no hidden fees and full transparency, and you can test out Linode services for free by using the link in the description and claiming an $100 60-day credit for any new accounts. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Linode over the past few years, and one last thank you to them for sponsoring this video. Alright, so I'm on my computer now. I'm in Visual Studio Code, which is where I'm going to write my code. You can do this wherever you'd like, and I'm going to run you through a very quick table of contents. What I'm going to explain to you, and all these timestamps will be in the description by the way, is first of all the different types of styling. Then I'm going to talk to you about CSS selectors. I'm then going to discuss colors and backgrounds. We're then going to get into block elements versus inline elements. We're then going to talk about widths and heights and the different units you can use for that. Then we're going to talk about the box model, so margin, padding, border, outline, etc., the actual content as well. We're then going to talk about Flexbox. So this is going to be how you actually make different responsive layouts and some of the common Flexbox properties you need to know. Then we're going to talk about positioning and Z-index, so you can do things like layer objects on top of each other, have items that are absolutely positioned, and kind of learn how that works. Now, there is a million CSS properties I could go through here. A lot of them I'm just going to skip over or mention really quickly. The goal here is to teach you the absolute minimum that you need to know to be competent in CSS. All the stuff I'm showing you here will really make up about 90% of the styling you're going to be doing if you're working on something that's not overly complicated. So just knowing this will make you much, much faster when it comes to writing CSS and styling documents, especially when it comes to laying out different stuff, which is where I see a lot of people struggle. So keep that in mind. I myself am not a CSS expert, but I'm definitely qualified to explain to you how these things work. And with that said, let's dive in. So the first thing I want to do here is run you through my environment setup. So obviously I'm using Visual Studio Code. I would recommend that. It's probably a good tool to learn how to use. And I have two documents here, tutorial.html and style.css. Now, I will show you how we link the style sheet and all of that, but just create two documents here, one HTML, one CSS, and put them in the same directory and then open them up in some file or some IDE or whatever you want. Next, I have in Visual Studio Code this extension called Live Server. Now, you don't need this, but this makes it so you don't have to manually refresh the HTML document. Instead, what will happen is it will automatically update for you whenever you make a change to the document. So kind of a useful thing for the video. That's what I'm using. Just figured I'd show you that. All right, so now that we have gone through that, what I'm going to do is just open up my HTML document in my browser, and I'm going to do that by running Live Server. So once you install Live Server, you should see it at the bottom of the screen. And if you go to your HTML document and you actually have HTML content, it will show you a button that says Go Live. So first, let's just make an HTML document, I'm just going to use kind of the built-in snippets here from, what do you call this, VS Code. And then I'm going to click on this button here and go live. All right, I just had to get rid of another server I had running there, so that's why you saw that. Okay, so now I have my HTML document here. It's running on port 5500, and I'll just show you that if I, let's make this a bit smaller, make a change here and call this like document 1. Notice it just automatically updates. I didn't actually have to update it. Okay, so let's make this a bit smaller here, just so I can see the rest of my code. All right, so we have our HTML document, we have our style sheet. For now, we're just going to talk about the different types of styling and kind of how you apply styles to elements. So let's just create a basic p tag here in the document. I'm going to assume that you know the basic HTML elements, by the way, and let's see how we would apply some kind of styling to this. So there's kind of 3 different methods. The first method is inline styling. Now, inline styling is not recommended. It can get very messy when you have large documents, but essentially it involves passing a parameter or attribute here to the tag itself called style. Now, you just say style equals, then you're going to have a string, so either in single or double quotation marks, and you can write the styles that you want directly in here. So, for example, if I want to change the color of the text, I could say color equals, maybe we just go with aqua. I'm going to add my semicolon there, and then notice that this changes right away. Now, if I wanted another style, I could do something like background dash color. Let's just make this blue. And now you're going to see that I get a blue background color for the whole p tag. That is inline styling. Again, you can see why this would be a bit messy. You don't really get the syntax highlighting either, so I wouldn't recommend this method, but sometimes if you just want to test something, it can be useful. The next method we have is writing your styles directly in the HTML document, but in one tag, which is a style tag. So the way you do this is you write a style tag directly in the head of the HTML document, and then you just write the styles that you want, and you apply them using CSS selectors. Now I'm going to talk about the selectors later, but for now, if we want to target the p tag, we'll just write p, and then inside of here, I could say color is equal to blue, and notice here that now my p tag will change to the blue color. So those are your first 2 methods. You have the styles like this in the HTML document and your inline styles right on the element itself. So now that we've looked at those 2 methods, I'll just mention that this one here, although it is better than inline styles, is still not usually preferred because you're kind of mixing the styles and the content together, and you can get a really massive document when you have all of the styles up here and then all of the content of the page. It's just not really preferred. Instead, what you want to do is you want to use an external style sheet. So I have this style sheet, again, it's in the same directory, and the way that I link this style sheet here to my HTML document is I go in the head tag of my HTML, and I write the following tag, which is link. Now, this can be used to link a bunch of stuff, not just style sheets, but to do a style sheet, you're going to say rel is equal to style sheet, and then you're going to say the href, which is essentially the location, and you are going to link it to the name of your style sheet, which in this case is styles.css. So now I have actually linked this style sheet directly here into my HTML document. And now if I go and write my styles here for the p tag and I say color blue, you're going to see it changes, and now we have kind of our styles separated from our content. All right, so there you go. We have concluded section 1 with the different types of styles. Now I'm going to talk to you about the different CSS selectors. So a selector is the way that you're targeting specific elements. Now we've already seen one, and this selector is the most basic. This is just the tag name selector. I don't know if that's actually what you call it, but that's what I'm going to call it. And it just means that you write the name of the tag you want to target, and then you just put all of the styles here. Now, I kind of assumed you guys knew the format of the styles, but I'll just quickly go through it. Whenever you're styling something, you're going to do your open curly brace and your close curly brace. And then inside of here, you're going to write the style property. In this case, it's going to be color. You're then going to do a colon, and then you're going to write whatever the value of that property is. And then you're going to finish that off with a semicolon if you have multiple styles. If you just have one style, you don't need to have it. But if I wanted to add another one, I need my semicolon to kind of terminate that line and move down to the next style. And then in here, I would write the rest of the styles, and I would be good to go. So syntax is pretty straightforward. However, sometimes we don't want to just target the entire tag name, right? If I do this, this means every single p tag in my document is going to have the same style. So if I add another one down here, you see that they're all going to be blue because I'm targeting the p tag directly. Instead, what you want to do is target specific elements, at least in many cases, and there's different ways to do that. One of the first and most popular ways to do that is using an ID. Now, an ID is simply a unique identifier that you add to an element. Now, you cannot have the same ID on multiple elements. You have to have a unique ID every single time you use it, so that's a bit of a limitation, but sometimes it's nice if you want to target one specific element and you're not going to be reusing those styles. So in this case, if I say ID, and let's just go with p tag like that, now what I can do if I want to access just this specific p tag is I can select it using its ID. So to do that, I'm going to put the pound sign, which stands for ID, and then the name of my ID, which in this case is going to be p tag. Now that I do that, you can see that in my HTML document, I'll just zoom in here so you can see it, it turns blue. There you go. I've selected an element by ID. Now let's just see what happens if we add the same ID here. Actually, forget what's going to happen here. It looks like it did work, so I guess we can use the same ID. However, you're not supposed to have the same ID on multiple tags, so kind of consider this a bit of a cheat. You're not supposed to do that. All right, so that was the second way. The third way, and the most popular way, is using class names. Now, a class is the following. You just say class is equal to, and then you give this a name. Usually, by the way, the convention is to use a dash whenever you have a space. So in this case, I'm going to say class, and let's just call this the same thing, actually. We'll just call it p tag. And now, if I want to reference the class from my CSS, rather than a pound sign or a number sign, I use the period. So I'm going to say period, and then p tag, and then color, and then red. And notice now I've changed this class here, or this p tag, to have the color red. Now, the advantage of classes is that you can reuse them, or at least, I guess you could reuse IDs, but you're not supposed to reuse IDs. With classes, you are supposed to reuse them. Anyways, in this case, I can add this class to another p tag, and now the same styles will be applied. Now, there is a bunch of other advanced selectors in CSS. I'm not going to walk you through them. There's ones where you can select like the first element or every other element. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I almost never find myself having to use these advanced selector patterns. If you need them, you can look them up, but just understand that you can do things like select the 7th last element, or select an element inside of this element that has this attribute on it. There's all this crazy stuff. I don't really find myself having to use it, so I'm not going to walk you through it. What I will show you, though, is how you select elements within another element. So let's do this. Let's remove all of our IDs and our classes, and let's see how we do this. So let's say I have a div just standing for division, right? And inside of here, I have 2 p tags. Now let's add a class to the div. So let's say class is equal to section 1. Now, let's say I want to select all of the p tags inside of section 1, and I don't want to have to add classes or IDs to the p tag. Well, to do that, I can select the class, which is going to be section 1. So I can say dot section 1. Then I can do a space and a p, and then I can say color and just make it red like that. Now what I'm doing is saying, okay, all of the p tags inside of section 1, I want to color red. So it's kind of just going in this order, right? I'm looking for section red. Or section 1, once I find that, then I'm getting all the p tags, then I'm coloring those red. Now you could continue this and keep nesting it. Like I had another div here. Let's say class equals section 2, and now I put my p tag in here. Notice that, first of all, both these p tags are going to be red because this div is still inside of section 1. Even though this p tag, is inside of section 2, since section 2 is inside of section 1, it's still being selected. However, if I just wanted to select the one in section 2, then I could say section 1 dot section 2. And if I could unhighlight this, you'd see that now this is red. So I've just kind of chained that. Now, continuing even further, what I could do is just select section 2, right? Now, this will work as well because I can find section 2 directly. And there you go. Now, one more thing to show you is that I could do this. I could say section 1 div and then p. And now I'm selecting this, so I didn't actually need to add a class. I'm just selecting all of the divs, and everything inside of all of the divs that's a p tag, I am going to highlight red or change color to red. Hopefully that makes sense, but those are really all you need to know for the basic CSS selectors. Again, if you need more advanced ones, just look them up, and you're probably not going to have to use them very often. All right, so now we are moving on to colors and background colors. Now, I'm just going to show you how you set different text colors as well as the background colors of elements, which is, again, 99% of what you're going to be doing, and then I will show you the different units and kind of types of colors you can use for other properties as well, say like the underline color or the border color or stuff like that. Now, as you can see, when we want to change the color of text, we use the color attribute. Now, that is different from the background color attribute. Background color is going to set, well, the background color, and color just sets the text color, at least when we're talking about something like a p element. Now, to set the color, you have to give it a value. Now, there's a bunch of different values that are accepted here. The most common and the one that I use all the time is just the built-in string values, the kind of predefined colors. So, like, you can type black, you can type red. You can see that a bunch of them are kind of showing up. There's actually a ton of different options here when it comes to the predefined colors, like rosy brown, like very, very specific option, but you can see that I can do that. Now, other than the built-in color strings, you can also pass an RGB value or a hex value. So if I want to do a RGB value, then what I do is I write the function RGB, standing for red, green, blue. I put my parentheses, and then I write 3 values in the range of 0 to 255. I'm not really going to explain RGB, but this is the amount of red, green, and blue, and having those 3 different values can give you essentially any color on the color spectrum. So if I wanted red, I would do 255, 00. Notice I get red, and in VS Code it actually tells me what the color is, which is kind of nice here. If I go 255, 0, 255, I get purple. If I do full 255s, that's going to give me white because every color combined, or red, green, blue all combined, gives you white. If you were to do a bunch of zeros, then that would give you black. Now, one other thing you may want to do is you may want to add transparency or an alpha value to your color. So in this case, what you can do to add that is you can say RGBA. A stands for alpha, and this is a value between 0 to 1 that represents the percentage of opacity of the object. So in this case, if I do 1, this is fully opaque. If I do 0, this is completely transparent, and then something like 0.5 would be 50% transparent, or I guess 50% opaque, whatever way you want to say it, and you can see that we can actually see through it. No pun intended there. But that is how you do an alpha value when you're using RGB, add transparency. The next thing we have is hex codes. Now, a hex code is pretty much the exact same thing as RGB, except rather than doing a value from 0 to 255, you're going to do 2 numbers, or 2 digits, I guess you could call it, in the range of 0 to F. Now, I'm not going to explain to you exactly how hex works, but essentially, if you wanted to do white with hex, then that would be 6 Fs, right? So each 2 numbers represents 1 RGB value. So 2 Fs is 255. And if you had 2 zeros, that would be 0, right? So that's kind of the color you get. You get this like teal color. Anyways, that's how it works with hex. You have 6 digits here in the range to 0 to F. Each 2 digits represents 1 RGB value, and most color codes you're going to be grabbing are in hex format. So you can write just the hex code here. All right, so continuing here, if you want to add opacity to hex values, it's actually pretty easy. You just add 2 numbers at the end of the hex value. Those 2 numbers combined can be in the range of 0 to 99, representing the opacity. So if I do something like 90, I'm getting 90% opaque, right? If you want it to be fully opaque, well, then obviously you just leave it. You don't add that. If you want it to be 10%, you do 10, right? If you want it to be 20, you add 20 like that at the end of the hex value. Now, one thing I will note, other than the transparency, is when you are writing the hex values, it doesn't matter if you use lowercase or uppercase numbers. So, lowercase f, sorry, not numbers, I mean letters. Lowercase f is going to be the same as capital F. It doesn't matter, so just keep that in mind when you do the hex values. All right, I think that's pretty much it for colors and kind of how you set the colors. I will show you that, of course, we can just add the same thing here with background colors. So if I do background color black now, we should actually be able to read this text. And the background color is going to set kind of the entire, it's going to set for the entire width of the object, the entire size of this. So it's not just going to stop here at the end of the text, because this text actually takes up the entire block, which is actually what I'm going to talk about now. All right, so as I was saying, now I want to discuss to you the difference between inline elements and block elements and kind of this property called display. So right now we're looking at 3 p tags, and we kind of just take for granted the fact that they're all in a different line. They've all kind of evenly spaced themselves out here, and they all, go beneath each other. They're not crammed together on the same line. Now, the reason that actually happens is because there is a property by default on all of these paragraph tags called display, and that is set to block. Now, you have different kind of defaults in HTML. Some tags are going to have block as their default. Some are going to have inline. Now, what block means is that there is going to be a line break after this object, let's call it that, and it's going to make the next item in the DOM go down to the next line. So in this case, these all have display block, so you see that they're all on different lines. That's intentional because after this is kind of written onto the document, it adds a line break, and then the next element is written, adds a line break, and if I were to add something else, it would go on the next line because this has display block. Now, to show you this in action, let's just make this select all of our p tags, and let's go here and change the display property. So you need to actually type display. So as I was saying, by default, it is block. We want to change it, though, to be inline. Now, when we change it to be inline, notice that they no longer have a line break. They only take up the amount of space, which is equal to the content of the paragraph tag. So if I move this over now, you can see that they all go on the same line, and they're all kind of spaced out with just what the default spacing would be, right? Now, if we change this back to be block, then they go on their new line. So you just need to understand that, because sometimes you'll get some weird layouts because you don't realize that you have objects that are display block, and they're forcing everything down a line when you don't necessarily want that, and you may want to change their style here, the display, to be inline. Now, there is a few other options here. There's one called inline block. Now, I don't ever really use this, and I don't really feel qualified to necessarily explain how this works. It has something to do with setting the width and the height of the object, and anyways, I won't really get into it. You guys can look up inline block if you want. One other one for inline or for display here is none. Now, if you do none, it just makes this invisible, right? It just gets rid of the actual object. So I don't know, that could be useful if you wanted to have some hidden object on the screen for some reason. Okay, so that was it for inline versus block. Just understand that. Again, that's important to know. Let's change this back to inline, though, and let's start looking at widths and heights. All right, so I just set up a simple example here so I can talk to you about the width and the height and explain kind of how this works. So this is a bit confusing, especially at the very beginning, but once you understand kind of the fundamentals of the width and the height and the document, it becomes very easy to position elements and kind of set them dynamically. So first of all, understand there's many different ways to set the width and the height. When you use something like Flexbox, it can be automatically set for you. When you're using different units like percentage, pixels, rem, stuff like that, you can manually kind of specify the height of objects. Now, the first thing that we should really understand is what is the height and the width of our body? How is that relative to the HTML document itself? And then we'll look at specific elements inside of that. Now, what I like to do to make this really easy is set background colors on everything so you can kind of see how much space they're actually taking up and get a visual sense of the width and the height. So the first thing we want to look at is the width and the height of the body. Right now, I've set the background color here to be aquamarine, and notice it's taking up the entire screen. Now, that gives you the illusion that the body is the entire width and height of the screen. That's actually not the case, and I'll show you how we can prove that. So understand that your body is inside of your HTML tag, right? HTML is kind of the first tag that you have. So if I set the background color here to be black, now you'll notice that the body is actually only taking up the size of its content. Now, you might say, oh, well, the HTML document must be the entire size of the screen. That's actually not true either. I'll show you that in a second. What happens is when you set the background color on the body or the HTML document, it just sets it for the entire page, even if the size, like the height and the width of the body in the HTML, are not the entire size of the screen. I know, pretty confusing, but you can see when I set the background color on HTML, now the body is only taking up the size of its content, and you can kind of see that because this teal color is in the middle, and then if we didn't have background color for these two elements, all of this would be the teal color. All right, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but let's see now how we could maybe change the height of our body. So if I go to height here, there's a bunch of different ways to do this, right? I can try using something like percentages, I can use pixels, I can use REM, which I'll talk about in a second, but let's look at the most common, which is probably pixels. So I can specify manually the height of my body by using this px unit, which stands for pixels. So if I say 100 pixels, now you can see that my body is 100 pixels, and some of you may be saying, well, that's way more than 100 pixels. Remember that I'm like zoomed in like crazy here, right? So that's why it's looking like it's massive. Anyways, I've set it to 100 pixels, and now I've just kind of manually specified the size. Now, the issue with this is that as I change the size of the screen, it just stays the same because it's a static size. It's not relative to the viewport or the size of my screen. So usually what we want to use is a percentage. So I want to set that to 100%. Now, when I set this to 100%, if I want to take up the entire screen, you would expect that it's going to be 100% of the screen. However, this percentage is relative to the parent of the tag. So when I set a percentage here on body, it's 100% of the height of the parent. Now, in this case, the HTML tag, or the HTML, I guess, parent, its height is just equal to the content of whatever's inside of it. So setting this to 100% doesn't make any difference because this doesn't have a height set. So what I would need to do if I wanted this body to actually take up 100% of the screen is I would first need to set the height of the HTML tag. So I would say height, and then I could set this to 100%. Now, the parent of the HTML tag will be like the entire document itself, like the entire screen. So now you see my body actually gets 100% because I've set the HTML height. If I don't have the HTML height set, then this doesn't work because 100% of nothing is, well, still nothing, or the size of the content. Okay, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, one quick note here on the width by default is going to take up the entire width of the screen. So even if I remove all of my content here, I still get the body taking up, the entire width of the screen because that's just the default here for my document. Okay, so hopefully that's clear in terms of body and HTML. Now, if we wanted to say change the width of the body, of course, we could do the same thing. And if I change this to say 50% width, since by default HTML is taking up 100% width, now I take up about half of the screen in my body tag. All right, so we're getting some good progress here. Next thing I'll talk about is why we have this kind of black, really margin is what it is around the body. By default, your body is going to be kind of offset from the HTML document itself very slightly so that you get not all of your content kind of squished up against the edge of the screen. Now you can remove that if you want using a margin property. If we just set margin equal to 0%, then notice here that we're getting what we would expect, right? Everything is coming down. Now, if I remove all of my content, you'll see here that now the body takes up the entire screen. The reason why it wasn't taking up the entire screen before is because by default, my paragraph tag will have a margin to the top. So if I removed both of my paragraph tags here and I just have my divs, now you see I go up to the top of the screen, right? Hopefully that kind of makes sense. But anyways, you have by default the margin, I think it's like 5% or something like that. Maybe it's less than that. I don't know what it is. For the body, you can remove that by just setting margin 0. So I just wanted to explain kind of why you're seeing that outline for now. Okay, continuing here, what do we want to discuss next? Probably the different units and setting widths and heights and all of that kind of stuff. So as you've already seen, this percentage unit only works when the height of your item, the height of your parent, is actually set. Either it's a percent of something else or it's a fixed height. That's the only time percent works. If you just try to do 100% and you have no defined height, that doesn't work. The next unit we could talk about here is going to be vertical height or vertical width. So let's say we don't want to set the height on our HTML document here, but we still want our body height to be the entire height of the screen. Well, the way that we can do this is we can use this unit, which is VH, which stands for vertical height. Now, vertical height is going to be the height of the viewport. So as I change the size here of my viewport, you're going to see that the size of the body is going to automatically adjust based on the size of the viewport. And since I have this margin here, it's overflowing the screen a tiny bit because it's getting 100% of this whole thing, but it's kind of starting here. So it's going down a bit, right? Hopefully that would make sense. So that's VH, that's vertical height. That will just use the vertical height of the viewport. Now, same thing, we can do VW, which is viewport width. And now you see that the height is equal to the width of the viewport. Okay, so those units, pretty straightforward. If I did 50, then I would get, 50%, right, of the vertical width. Okay, after we have VW and VH, we have pixels. Now, I don't know if I showed this already, but pixels is just going to be, you're statically setting the size of this, no matter what the screen size is, to be 100 pixels. So if I go here, right, and I start moving this around, if I could select my object here, come on, let me select this. It won't let me grab the bottom. Okay, there you go. You're going to see that the height doesn't change. It just always is going to be 100 pixels. So usually you want to stay away from using pixel values unless you're using very small pixel values for stuff like margin, padding, etc. All right, so the next two units to show here for height are going to be EM and REM. Now we'll start with REM. Now REM stands for the root of the default font size of the document. Now I know that seems a little bit confusing. I believe by default REM is 16 pixels, but what I can do is something like 1 and then rem, and what that sets the size of my body to be is 1 multiplied by whatever the default font size is for my document. Now that can be set in the browser, so if someone has like a really massive default font size, then this will adjust based on that, right? So this is the root of, I guess, say the document, the browser, whatever you want to refer to it as, whatever the user has set for their default font size, that's what this refers to. So if I do 10 rem, I get 10 times, and I believe the default is 16, so that gives me 160 pixels. If I do 5, right, 5 times 16, whatever that is, that's what you get here. 4 times 16, etc. Now, if I upgrade or change the font size or lower it, then this adjusts based on that. Again, this is the root. All right, the next unit here is EM. Now, EM oftentimes will be the same as REM, but this is actually relative to the nearest parent. All right, sorry for the cut. What I just did here is set the font size on my body to be 20 pixels because I want to show you the difference between EM and REM. So I'm going to go to 1 here, and I'm going to say height, and this is going to be equal to, and I'm going to use the EM unit this time, 5EM. Now, as I was saying, EM is relative to the font size of the nearest parent. So in this case, the font size of the nearest parent is 20, so I'm going to get 100 pixels for this height. Now, if I change this to be REM, you should see that this shrinks a slight bit. I think you can see that, right? If I go EM versus REM, notice that the size is changing. And the reason for that is that the root font size is 16 of the entire document, but the font size of the nearest parent is 20, so I'm going based off that. So a lot of times these are going to be the preferred units to use, especially if you're trying to scale for kind of accessibility reasons. Like if someone has a really massive font size, you probably want the content on your screen to show up larger for them because they're probably visually impaired. So that's kind of why you might use EM or REM. Personally, a lot of times I just use the percentages to do stuff, percentage of viewport, but these are good units to know. And a lot of, like pro web guys probably use EM and REM for pretty much everything. All right, so that is pretty much it when it comes to width and height. Those are the main units that you need to know. And let's move on to the next topic. All right, so now we can move on and talk about the box model, which is a very fundamental aspect of CSS. So the box model is essentially trying to tell you what different properties on your box or on your different DOM elements actually do and kind of how they change the spacing and layout of this element. So we have 4 main properties we need to understand here. We have the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. Now the content isn't really a property, but it is important to understand what the content is. So whenever we're looking at these different tags here, we can kind of think of them as containers that are holding content. In this case, we have a p tag, its content is the text that we wrote. We have a div tag, its content is the p tag, which then its content, nesting inside is the text, right? We have the body, its content is all of these div tags together. So by default, the size of your container is going to be equal to the size of the content. And sometimes, the content size will be adjusted. In this case, we have the paragraph tag. And since it's display block, the size of the content is actually the entire line or the entire width of the parent, right? That's just how the display block elements work. Continuing though, we have our padding. Now the padding is what spaces the content out from the edge of the box. So let me show you what I mean by this. I'm going to say padding, and I'm just going to use the unit 10 pixel. For the padding, you can use the exact same units you saw before. So rem, em, percentage, vertical height, vertical width, all of those work for the padding. Usually use pixels, but that's fine. You can use whatever you want. So notice that when I add 10 pixels of padding, first of all, what that does is add it on every single side, and the padding vertical is slightly different than the padding horizontal, hence why you're kind of seeing it look, different here. It's also based on the way that I've zoomed in here. Anyways, just it doesn't really matter, but anyways, you're seeing 10 pixels of padding on each side. That's essentially what I've added. Now, you can notice here that what happens is you see this antique white kind of background color now appearing because the box for this div container is now larger because of the added padding. I've now padded the content inside of the box by 10 pixels, and you now see the background color. Whereas when I remove the padding, now you don't see the background color because the size of the container is simply the size of the content. So the padding, again, is the space between the content and the outside of the container, okay? So there you go, we have our padding. Moving on next, we have the border. Now the border is going to start at the edge of the box, right? Wherever the padding is. So if you have 0 padding, it's going to start right on the edge of the content. If you have 5 pixels of padding, it's going to start 5 pixels outside of the content, right? Wherever the box is, you can kind of see with this highlight color. So when I write my border here, and by the way, the way you can do a border is you can specify the thickness, you can specify the style, and then you can specify the color. So let's just go with black. Notice here that now my border gets added to the edge of the box. Now it's actually adding 1 pixel kind of beyond the padding. It's not staying within the padding, right? So if I have 10 pixels of padding and then a 1 pixel border, you could say I have 11 pixels between the very edge of the box and the content. That's important to understand if you're trying to go with very specific type things. Now, when I do something like 5 pixels, right? Okay, now I have a 5 pixel border. And again, same thing. The padding has not decreased. The padding is still 10 pixels. I've just now added 5 pixels beyond the padding. I know it doesn't quite look proportional to the actual padding you're getting vertically and horizontally. It's just, again, kind of how this is working right now. Don't worry about that too much. Anyways, that's how you do the border. Now, I will mention, because we're talking about padding, you can specify the padding in different units and for different sides, right? So you have properties like padding left, you have properties like padding right, padding bottom. This is usually the case for anything that would be kind of square around everything, so you can kind of change those here. And same thing with the border, right? You could say border left, and then you can make a border on the left side. You could say border right, you can make a border on the right side. What I'm doing is kind of just the shorthand here for adding on every single side. Now, additionally, when you're talking about padding, you can specify the padding on different sides. So I can do 5 pixels, 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels. And excuse me, now what I've done is I've added 5 pixels, I believe, to the top, 10 pixels to the right, 5 pixels to the bottom, and 10 pixels to the left. I think that's correct, but let's just make this really massive to see. Yes, so this is the left, definitely. This, let's see, is going to be the top, okay? And this is going to be the right, which would make this the bottom for the padding. Okay, you can just mess around to kind of test what they are, but that's how you do the padding. All right, so we talked about the padding, talked about the border. Next, we have the margin. Now, the margin is the separation between the object and other objects on the screen. So to add a margin, you write margin, and then again, you can specify this in whatever unit you want. So I can do something like 5, let's just go with EM. So now I've added 5 times EM. EM, I think, will be 16 because it's just going to be the root because I haven't specified. And now I'm getting 5 times 16 units of padding on every single, or sorry, of margin on every single side. Let's make this a bit smaller so we can actually see this, 5 pixels. And now notice again, I'm getting 5 pixels of margin every single side. If I increase this, I get 10 pixels, and I'm spacing my object out from other objects. So the main thing to really take away here is the difference between padding and margin. Margin is the outside of the box. Padding is the space between the outside of the box and the interior content. Very important to understand the difference. Same thing with margin. You can add like margin left, margin right, margin bottom. You can specify it like I did the padding. It's 5 pixels, 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels. And of course, you can use percentage and whatever other units, you want here for the margin. All right. I think that's going to do it for the box model. Make sure you understand this. Practice with it if you need to. Just make sure you know at least the difference between the content, the padding, the margin, and the border. I mean, that's really all I discussed here, but you need to know that. Very, very important to get good at CSS. All right, so it is now time to move on to Flexbox. Now, this is one that a lot of people get pretty confused with. I'm going to explain it as best as I can. Personally, I think it's fairly intuitive to understand. Once you know kind of the main aspects of Flexbox, it's very easy to design responsive layouts that automatically scale with the screen size. This is the preferred way to lay stuff out. At least this is what I like doing and what most people I see do all of the time. There is some other types of layouts. You have like a grid layout, for example. However, I'm just really going to focus on Flexbox because I think this is the most powerful one and what most of you probably need to learn to be able to design HTML pages. All right. So we have our 2 divs here, right? Now, right now they're aligned, vertically. Now, there is other ways than using Flexbox to align these horizontally. However, what I want to do is align them kind of in a row. So to do that, I'm going to start using Flexbox. Now, essentially to use Flexbox, you need to set this property display equal to flex on some parent container. Now, in this case, I'm using the body tag because we have a very simple document here and I have 2 divs inside of the body. And what I'm saying is, okay, my body tag, I want this to be display flex. As soon as I do that, it now allows me to use my different Flexbox attributes or properties. Now, by default, everything that's in a Flexbox, so when you have display flex, it makes Flexbox, is going to be aligned in the row or in a row. So what's referred to as your main axis is going to be the row, and your cross axis is going to be the column or your y-axis, okay? So notice when I make this larger, I'm aligning everything on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm going to make this a bit smaller so it's easier to see here on this side. Okay, so that's what happens when you make a display flex. Automatically, you align things in a row rather than a column. Now, what I'd like to do is I would like to make it so that these items are in the center. Now, the way I can do that is I can use the property justify content and set this to center. Now, what this does is it will justify the content in your Flexbox in the center of the main axis. Now, because by default we're using row as our main axis, we get this centered in the middle of the screen horizontally. However, what if we want to do this vertically? Well, to do this vertically, we need to use another property called align items. Now, align items does the exact same thing as justify content, except it does it across the cross axis, which means it's going to use the opposite axis of the main axis. So if it's horizontal is main, then vertical is going to be your cross axis, right? Now, right now you might be saying, well, Tim, this isn't aligned in the center. The reason it's not aligned in the center is because the body height isn't set and the HTML height isn't set. So technically this is the center based on the height of the body. But if I just do height equals 300 px, now you'll see it'll be in the center. And to even prove this to you again, let's just go background color black. And you can see that, again, I forgot I can't do that because it's going to fill the entire thing. Anyways, just trust me, it's in the center based on the height. If we do 100 VH here, then you'll see it'll just go right in the middle, okay? And let's actually just say margin 0px so that now it looks like it's actually directly in the middle. Okay, anyways, that's how that works. Now, the thing is, we can change the direction of our main axis to be column if we want to. And the way we do that is we say flex direction, and we make this column. So now when I make this column, I'm aligning my items in a column, not in a row, and they're going to be in the center again. The reason they're in the center is because now justify content, what this does is it aligns me in the center vertically, and what align items does is align me in the center horizontally, because we flip the axes, so now these are going to flip. So if I remove this, notice that now I take up the entire space because I'm not aligning in the center. And just by default, it's going to fill the container. That's what happens when you use Flexbox, okay? So hopefully you're kind of getting the hang of this. You do have to practice this quite a bit to get it, but just understand main axis, cross axis. Once you know that, it becomes very simple. Okay, there's a lot more to show you, but this is the basic for now. So let's remove these. And now notice that these are just going to take up the entire height of the screen because that's by default what they're going to do when you use display flex. And they are not aligned at all, right? They're just kind of starting. So the default here, when I say justify content, is what's known as flex start. Now this means align the items at the start of the flex box. Since my main axis is now my vertical axis, it's starting them at the top. Now we also have flex end. Now when I do flex end, what happens here, and sorry, I realized I changed the axis back to row, so what I said there was incorrect, but when I change this to flex end, since my main axis is the horizontal axis, now it goes to the right-hand side because I'm starting at the end of the flex box. You can see that. Now, there's a few other options here. One of them is space between. Now, when you use space between, it does exactly what it says. It's going to align them with all of the space in between the objects in the flex box. So this is quite nice when you want to have something on the left side and then all the way pushed to the right side of the container. You use space between and it aligns them evenly with the space between. Now let's see what happens if we add a third div here, right? Notice that now we get the exact same thing. So it's going to align perfectly. This one will be perfectly in the center and then the two will be on the side. And if I added one more, you can imagine what it's going to do, right? I'm not going to add another one to show you. Okay, great. So that's justify content. Space between, we also have space around. Now when you do space around, you'll see that we'll get the same amount of space around every single object. So kind of the margin of these objects are the exact same. And that's why you have now padding or margin on the left and right hand side. Okay, so those are the main ones. I think there's a few other ones, but those are really all the ones I've ever used. So that's what I'm going to leave it at. And let's just change this back to center. So now let's add align items to the mix. Now, when we use align items, we don't have all of the same attribute as we have for justify content. So you can kind of see my autocomplete's giving me a bunch here. We have center, flex end, flex start, stretch, which I won't go into, inherit, initial unset. Again, I'm not going to talk about all of those ones, but the main ones here would be center, flex end, flex start. So if I go flex end, right, and then I save that, now I'm going to go to the end of my cross axis. If I go flex start, now I go to the top or the beginning of my axis. And if I go center, then I go in the middle of the screen, right? So there you go. That is kind of the basics on aligning the items. So if you've ever wondered how to center a div, you do it using Flexbox. Very simple, right? Display flex, justify content center, align items center, and then any items inside of the Flexbox will automatically be aligned in the center of whatever that container is. Okay. Let's continue here and do some more advanced layouts. Again, there's a lot of stuff I can show you here. So the next thing I'm going to show you is gap. Now, what gap does is set a specific gap between the objects that you have. So like right now, if we look at this, these already have a margin on them. So that's why they're kind of separated the way they are. But if I remove the margin, so let's remove the margin from my items, they're squished together. A lot of times you don't want that, and it's also kind of annoying to add the margin directly on the object, because then what happens is you have to add it on every single item. And anyways, what will happen sometimes is that you can get some weird calculations going on because you're adding the margin to both the left and the right side of the object, when maybe you only want the margin between the 3 items, not between anything else. I don't know if that necessarily makes sense to you, but the gap property kind of fixes this problem. So when I add gap and I say 10 pixels, now what this does is add a 10 pixel gap along the main axis between the objects. So this is quite nice, because rather than me having to add a 5 pixel margin on every side of these objects, or on the left and right side to make it combine 10, I just put 10 and then it lays it out automatically for me as it should. And any items on the left and the right side that are not a part of the flexbox are now not having any margin applied to them, because the gap is only between these specific objects. Okay, I know that was a lot. I feel like I probably lost a few people there, but that's gap. And I believe there's also gap Y. Is there gap in the Y direction? I'm not sure if there's a gap in the other direction. Row gap. Okay, you guys can look that up. I think maybe it's just on the main axis, although for some reason I thought we had another gap property. Okay, but that's gap. That's the main one. All right, now we're going to talk about how we determine how much space objects in the flexbox take up. And to do that, I need to add some classes here. So let's just copy this and make this 2, if we could type properly, and 3, and make this 2 and 3. So let's say we want object 1 here to take up double the amount of space than both the other objects. Well, what I can do is use a flex property here and set this value to 2. Now, when I do that, what I'm essentially saying is I want this object to take up 2 flex spaces. Now, by default, my other objects are taking up 1 flex space, so it's going to take up 2 times more than my other objects. Right? There we go. I have 2, and then 1, 1. And actually, sorry, let me fix this. Flex 1 and flex 1. Since I didn't set flex 1 on my other objects, what happened there was I filled up as much possible space as I could with this object, because it's the only one who had the flex property set on it, and then my other 2 objects took up the minimum amount of space required for the container. Again, sorry about that. It was probably a little confusing what I described there, but now notice 2, 1, 1, and I'm filling the entire size of the flex container, because now I'm saying, hey, take up 2 times the amount of space as the other objects, and when you say the flex property, it's going to take up as much space as it possibly can relative to the width of the container. All right, so let's try this now with some different values. Let's go flex 2, 3, 2. Now, again, this is kind of what you're getting. I won't go through the math of exactly how that works, but you have 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 2 spaces, and whatever the total number of spaces are, it'll just divide by that and then figure out the width automatically. Okay, so that's kind of how flex works, and this will be based on the main axis of the flex box. So keep that in mind. Okay, if I change this now to 1, again, you get the same thing, 2, 1, 1, and then obviously if I made them all 1, then they're going to all evenly take up the same amount of space here on my main axis. Okay, I'm just looking at my cheat sheet to see if there's anything else I need to show you related to Flexbox. So that is the main thing. Now, there's a few other attributes here, and it gets pretty complicated. I could do an entire video on Flexbox where you have things like flex basis, you have things like flex overflow, or I don't know if that's what it's called. I think it's something like flex grow or flex shrink. There's all these other properties. I'm not going to get into them here, but there's ways to make your Flexbox so that objects kind of go on different lines. Okay, so I just went and looked at some of the other Flexbox properties. Again, as I was saying, there's so many. I can't go through all of them here. It's going to take way too long. So feel free to look them up if you want to learn more about Flexbox. What I just showed you is enough to do a lot of layouts, like a lot of different layouts you can do here just using this. So you should be fine with that. And obviously keep in mind that you can nest Flexboxes inside of other Flexboxes. So if you want to have like rows inside of columns or columns inside of rows, you can absolutely do that. I'm going to do another video actually kind of in this series, let's call it, where I go through building a layout and show you how to do the different Flexbox stuff shortly. Okay, let's continue though. Next thing I want to do is talk about positioning and Z-index. So let me clear this, let's get a new example, and then I will show you how that works. All right, so now it is time to talk about positioning. Now, this can be a little bit confusing, but I'm just gonna show you the basic types of positioning and how we kind of stack objects on top of each other and move them out of the regular document flow. So the default type of position for every object that we have on the DOM is static. Now, that's just the default. What that means is it's just gonna follow how you would assume everything's gonna work, okay? Static positioning. However, we have 4 other types of positioning. We have sticky, fixed, relative, and absolute. Now, the first one I'm going to show you is absolute. Now, an absolute position, and I've just added a, let's see here. So it's going to say position, not relative, absolute, means that we're going to position this object based on its first positioned parent. Now, a positioned parent is anything that is positioned in the document. So in this case, this container is positioned as Flexbox. It's positioning things, okay? Like it's positioned in the document. So when I say position absolute, I'm going to be positioning this item here based on that parent. So inside of the parent is kind of where I'm going to be moving it, if that makes sense. So now notice though, when I've made this position absolute, what happens is the other documents or the other elements inside of this container are ignoring this element. So if I just make this display none, then you can see here kind of what's happening is that these two are aligning as they would if this object wasn't there, right? Whereas this object is kind of following the positioning scheme of the container and again, ignoring the other objects around it, hence why they're kind of stacked on top of each other. Now, as soon as you add this position absolute, this allows you to use a few properties here on the element to align it or to position it. The first one is top. So you can pass top 0 pixels, and what that does is move you to the top of the container and puts you 0 pixels away. Now, if I said left, 0 pixels, I move to the very left of the container. Again, I am 0 pixels away from it. If I do 10, I'm now going to be 10 pixels away from the left side. Hopefully that makes sense. Of course, you can use right, and you can use bottom. Okay, and let me just get rid of top though, because that's not going to work. And now you see I'm 10 pixels away from the bottom. So that's the basics, but that only works if you are positioned not in a static positioning. Because if I now remove position absolute, it doesn't matter what I say here for bottom, it's not going to work because I'm not absolutely positioned. All right, so I've just reset a few things here. You can see I've moved my P container up. I've kind of changed some of the stuff. Anyways, point is I want to talk to you now about stacking and how we move stuff based on the Z index. Then I'll show you the other types of positioning. So the Z index is essentially the elevation on the page. An item that has a higher Z index will be on top of an item that has a lower Z index. However, this is only the case when you're using objects that are positioned. Now, what I mean by positioned is that they don't have the position type of static. So what you need to know by that is if you use absolute, relative, fixed, or sticky, Z index works. And if you're using a flex item. I won't talk about exactly why that's the case, but essentially all our P tags here, since they're inside of a flex container, they will be positioned and Z index will work on them. So let me show you how this works. So let's go background color here and make this green. And let's go background color here and make this blue. Now notice that the green right now is kind of on top of the blue, right? It's just the way it's laid out. That's how we have it. Now, what happens if I make a Z index property here of 1? So if I add Z index to 1 to my P tags here, notice that now they kind of go on top of my green box. Now I know it's kind of weird because they're not like filling the entire text content. Won't really get into that exactly, but just understand they've kind of moved on top, right? Whereas if I just make this back to 0, or actually set this like -1, actually it doesn't matter what I set it to because it has a value and the other one doesn't. But if I remove it now, the green goes on top, right? So if I set the Z index to 1, and then I go here, and I set the Z index to 2, now my green will go over top because it has a higher Z index value. And as you saw, if something doesn't have a Z index value, you can just imagine it has a value of like -infinity, right? Any Z index value will go higher than that, at least from my understanding. Okay, so that's kind of how the Z index works when you're using positioned elements. So useful to know. We'll talk about this later and show some better examples, but I just wanted to quickly kind of show you that. Okay, so now that we've looked at absolute, let's look at another type of positioning, which is going to be relative. So the relative positioning, and by the way, we're looking at this item here, is, if I can spell relative correctly, means that this item is going to be positioned relative to where it would normally be positioned. So if it's normally supposed to be here, that's where it's going to be until you start setting the top, right, left aspects, right? So here, this is where it's supposed to be. So now if I wanted to say move this, right, I could say bottom 10 pixels, and now I'm moving this 10 pixels off of the bottom because it's the bottom is where it's supposed to be, and I've just moved it 10 pixels off, right? And then same thing, I could say left 10 pixels, and now I'm going 10 pixels away from the left based on where it should be. So not based on the container that it's in or the first position container, it's based on where it should normally be in the document. So kind of useful if you need to slightly move something, but you don't want to move other objects. You can use position relative, and then again, of course, you can use the Z index when you have that type of positioning. So let's move to a different type of positioning. Let's use a fixed position. Now, the fixed position just means that this item here is going to be fixed based on the browser position. So let me do this here and go to height of my body and change this to 200 vertical height. So notice when I scroll, doesn't matter. This is just going to stay exactly where I've placed it, right? Which is bottom 10 pixels, left 10 pixels. So when you use fixed, you're fixed to the browser. You're kind of glued in one spot. And this is based on just the browser window itself. So if I make this larger, then it's still in the bottom left, okay? That's fixed. Pretty straightforward for that one. And the last one I have to show you is sticky. Now, the way that sticky works is actually I'm only really able to show you when I use something that's scrolling, because it's based on scrolling. So let me clear a few of these things and show you. So let me get rid of that. And let's remove all of this essentially. And I'm just going to change this to be position and then sticky. So the way that sticky works is it's based off your scroll position. So if I do something like top 0 pixels, what happens is as I scroll, it's going to stop when it's 0 pixels away from being at the top, right? Because that's what I've set it. Now, if I set it at 10 pixels, you're going to get a similar thing. But now as I scroll, as soon as I'm 10 pixels away from the top, it stops, okay? 25 pixels, same thing, right? Now, if I had this positioned at the bottom of the screen and I set the bottom, if I was scrolling up, then it would stay at the bottom of the screen. So it's actually common for people to use sticky for stuff like bottom nav bars or like footers or stuff like that, or top nav bars, for example, where as you scroll, you want it to kind of stay on the screen. So that's why you might use a sticky position. Anyways, I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up here. There was a few more things I wanted to mention, but this video is already quite long. I think I went through most of the fundamental CSS stuff. Of course, you are going to have to practice this. You can't learn everything you need about CSS in one single video, but hopefully this gave you a good introduction to a lot of these topics, showed you how to create different layouts, how you can use different common CSS properties. And as I was saying, I'm going to do a part 2 here where I just build out a web page and show you kind of how you put these skills into practice. With that said, if you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next one.